Welcome to this informational tutorial about the Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit, including tips and suggestions for facilitators. The Toolkit meeting is a process that highlights and celebrates a student's strengths and interests. I like to call them a student's can-dos. The team uses what they know about a student to bridge the barriers to participation and learning that can often be present in general education classrooms. Included with the link to this presentation is a complete copy of the toolkit components as well as a copy of this PowerPoint. If possible, you may want to have a printed set of these materials with you as we work our way through the information. If you do not have the components and would like a set, visit our Patten website at www.pattan.net and locate this information under Supports and Inclusive Practices. Or you can contact any one of the names at the back of this presentation for assistance. The Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network supports the initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education in Pennsylvania. The SaS Consideration Toolkit is a process that is supported through the Inclusive Practices Initiative. Our Patten offices are located regionally in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg in the Central Region, Pittsburgh in the West, and the East Office is located in Malvern. The Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit was designed to support the identification of supplementary aids and services, which are defined as the supports that are delivered in a general education setting. The Pennsylvania Department of Education is committed to IEP teams considering this environment of the general education setting prior to consideration of more restrictive placements. So as we get started, we want to think about the outcomes for this presentation. So first of all, we're going to examine the toolkit and all of its components. There are several pieces to it, so we're going to look at each one in a little depth. We're going to then consider the details and potential supports a facilitator or meeting leader should include when planning to facilitate a Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit. And then finally, we'll explore tips that can assist you as a facilitator and that can move the meeting along smoothly and ensure the most effective, positive outcomes for students. So when we think about inclusive education, we want to think about the Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit as a support that was designed to help a student's team with determining those supplementary aids and services. Supplementary aids and services, again, refers directly to the supports and aids, and notice that's an aid without an E. We're not talking about a person, we're talking about supports or things that can assist students, or specially designed instructions that can be provided to a student within a general education environment, typically, but not exclusively, classrooms. So it could be in thinking about, an extracurricular activity. It could be a support they may need in another different general education environment. So we think about the gym or out on the field or the recess if in an elementary school. Maybe there's a student lobby in a high school. These are all environments that a student may need to have a team consider what their supports could look like. So the Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit was designed to examine very specific classrooms or environments. So this meaning that the indicators that are used throughout the toolkit reference like teacher practices. And we know that teacher practices can vary even within a grade. So if you have an elementary school and you have a fourth grade classroom, but there's 3 or 4 fourth grade classrooms, each one of those teachers are delivering the same content, but how they deliver the instruction can look very different. Sometimes we call it the art of teaching, or it's the way that the design of teaching is. So we want to make sure that we're looking at a specific classroom when we're looking at these supports. for it to be the most effective. So the more specific you can identify the teacher and the classroom / content area, when we think about secondary, you are addressing the more effective, the more specific you can be, the more effective the outcome of the toolkit. So we also think about inclusive educational practices through a three-pronged measure. And I'm bringing this up because I feel it does have great value when we think about the toolkit and how that toolkit can really support what's happening in that classroom. So when I go out and support teams, I typically recommend that teachers always keep these three pieces of inclusive practices in their minds as a barometer of how things are progressing. So first of all, we're going to think about membership, and you'll see some membership types of questions come through the toolkit. So it's the right or the ability to access that wide range of learning opportunities, activities, settings available, and environments available to all children. So they have a desk, they have the materials they need, they have the materials are in a format that they can understand. We are thinking about their ability to have that locker in the hallway or that cubby in that elementary classroom. So they're on the roster like any other student. And then we also think about participation. So participation is next. We find that teachers a lot of times do really well on the membership, but when it gets to the participation, now we're having some intentional engagement in the ongoing activities. So if the teacher's working in projects or she's putting the students in small groups, how is the student with disabilities also engaging in all that? How are they interacting in that? So it's a little more than that physical placement. It's all that engagement that's going on in the activities of the classroom. And you can see from the picture on the screen, we have one student that's obviously not engaged and other students that are. So you want to make sure you have that participation, and you're going to see lots of pieces where that toolkit makes or has the team really looking through that lens. And then, of course, at the very bottom is the learning. Not that it's not important, it is absolutely as equally important as the membership and participation, but you have that learning of the student, that they're connecting to the same standards in learning that is available to all students, but often at a reduced complexity level, but of equal rigor and challenge. So depending on the student's abilities that they bring to the table, you may be thinking about modifications sometimes with some kids. While the toolkit does not get down to that level, you could have those conversations that we do need modifications. So that can be part of what happens with this toolkit. So when and why to use the Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit. Love this cartoon. Michael Jean Greco. He is from the University of Vermont. He's well known for his research, but he's especially well known for his cartoons in regard to the many facets of inclusive education. And he also has a lot of work that he's done around paraprofessionals. So if you can ever get a hold of his work, it's well worth the cost to get these. Once you purchase his cartoons, then you can do whatever you want with them. You can put them in presentations. You can, he said, put them on T-shirts. They don't care. They very willingly share this. But when we think about inclusive education, one of the things that the toolkit really gets to is really avoiding what this particular cartoon is showing, that island in the mainstream. So you think about Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Cooper are still trying to figure out why Fred doesn't feel like part of a class. So he's not actively engaged in the same instruction. He doesn't have the same resources and materials. So you want to make sure that all of that is considered. And if there are barriers, what are those barriers and how can we bridge those barriers with what we know that student knows and can do. So the question often comes up when to use the toolkit, and why to use the toolkit. Some people will say that you should use it with every student, and that's not a bad idea, but the time necessary for the rich interdisciplinary and team discussion may make this not as realistic in schools. But it doesn't mean that when we are struggling and when we think about how to engage a student with participation in a general education classroom, that the toolkit is a great resource. We want to make sure that we do know that this tool is available to have us kind of bridge that. That is very challenging. We also know there are many skilled general and special educators out there who readily adjust options and can easily meet the needs of diverse learners in their classroom, but sometimes you need more, and that's okay. Some students are very diverse and they display varying ability levels, so sometimes you do need a village to put their brain power together to identify some ideas and supports that will improve and enhance participation. We also think that sometimes the team's not sure of the best way to move forward. So once a teacher's been assigned or multiple classes are an option at the secondary level, you may want to plan a toolkit meeting to make sure you're examining every possible option. What are some things that are going on? If Johnny was to be included in that tech ed class, what is it that they're doing in there, and what kind of supports would he need to bridge those barriers? So we want to make sure that we know the toolkit can be used to help us as we're looking at our options. The other thing is to think about, and I talk about these unique classroom structures. So teachers, can creatively present materials different from their colleagues. Doesn't make it wrong, doesn't make one right, one wrong, one better than the other, one not so good, but they are unique structures within a classroom that need to be examined to ensure that the student is maximizing their potential to participate and learn. That's why we go back to saying you need that specific class. We can't just say, well, what do they need to do in second grade? Well, who are the teachers in second grade? What teacher would you be considering this student to be a part of? So you want, in that classroom, you want to make sure that you're matching what happens. So, for example, one teacher may require several projects that are generated through the computer, and another teacher may have students doing similar projects, but those projects are handmade, and so the types of supports you may have to provide or the bridges you may have to build depending on the barriers are going to be as unique to the classroom as they will be for the student. Does that make sense? Think about one teacher may use lecture and notes and expect students to participate and keep up, and another teacher who's in the same grade level teaching the same content, same standards, may have more of a setup and encourage more small group inquiry. So the students are working in these smaller groups and then working together and talking and helping each other. So the support you would put in place there would look a lot different than the support you would put in place if the student was in a classroom with a teacher who's using lecture and notes. So those are the kinds of things that really underlie and make folks think about why we need to be as specific as possible when we're looking at this toolkit and why we may need to use this toolkit. So you have to very carefully examine whether or not there are barriers for a student, and the toolkit will help us do that. We will be able to say, well, here, this is the realities of this classroom. This is the way this teacher is currently teaching their classroom, and these are barriers, and it may not just be a barrier for the student you're focusing on, but it is a barrier you've identified for that student. So then we can use that toolkit to overcome barriers using the student's strengths and their interests and things we know about their abilities that will help them. So now we're going to take a look at the design of the toolkit. If you have it available, you may want to refer to a hard copy of the toolkit at this point. The toolkit was developed for Pennsylvania by Dr. Gail McGregor. She's currently a research professor out at the University of Montana, very well versed in all of this work around supporting students in inclusive environments. And the toolkit actually has 4 major sections, and they're labeled component A, B, C, and D. And as listed on the screen, you can see that one is just an overview. One takes us to really examine the student. Another one takes us to look at the classroom, and then we use information that we know about the student to gather information. So as a facilitator, you're the gatherer of the information and leading folks to provide that information. And then, of course, there's the final section, which really is provided for the IEP team to think about that implementation and the way to incorporate and think about all of this through that IEP process. So let's take a closer look. You ready? So here's Section A. Section A is the overview. They are all developed in a very similar manner, so they'll have the letter at the top of it. And this is really an introduction, and it gives you some ideas in regard to preparation. All of the components will have this particular page. This is the second page as part of it, as part of their component, and it will highlight where you are. It's kind of like a barometer or thermometer. It will let you know what part of the section you are on, the sequence, who should be involved, and some description of the component. And then it goes on to talk about the toolkit. It's very informative. It's not an active piece of the toolkit process, but it is certainly a very informative piece, giving that general understanding of all the components. So as a facilitator, and what I do as a facilitator, I recommend all participants of the toolkit have a copy and read this prior to the toolkit meeting. So when I'm working with that building administrator or the special ed director, whomever is leading the direction of pulling the team together, I'll ask them to share that. I'll make sure they have a copy of it and say, this is really helpful that everyone, including the parent, the teachers, the general ed teachers, the special ed teachers, all read this prior to coming into the meeting. So that's Section A, and there are many more pages to it. I just, for the sake of time, I just wanted to include a couple pages to give you an idea of what's included. So please, if you haven't already, you want to take the time to read that. Section B is an extremely important section because it gathers our information about the student. What makes this meeting a little different, or a lot different, I think, from many other meetings that are held around our students, is that this process is intended to celebrate the student and what we know what the student can do. We spend a lot of time in IEP meetings and evaluations discussing where the deficits are and what we know students don't have and need to reach, but this meeting focuses on what students can do. So if you emphasize anything, you want to emphasize this as the facilitator as part of the process with this Section B. So again, you see it looks similar on that title page, Section B, Component B, and it's really that student summary. We're going to look at the strengths, we're going to look at what the student can do, what their learning characteristics are. So again, you see now we've moved down a block into that second row, and it tells you a little bit about this Section B student profile. And the first page of this has where the strengths and interests are. The second one goes into some components about vision, hearing, fine motor, receptive, expressive, gross motor, and I emphasize to folks as they complete these, I want to have listed what the student is doing. When you look at the content areas below, reading, writing, listening, behavior, we want to know what supports the students they've been using in this area that have supported them, what's been identified and what's working for the student. And then we also look at the current levels of performance, again, what the students can do. And then some instructional methods that have been very successful. I again focus on the success. Show us what's worked, because those are the things we are going to be able to use and lead our team through when we think about bridges. So overall, what this section does is it captures information about what the student can do. And it should be completed with input from the teacher, parent, support and resource staff, anybody who works with the student. So I recommend that if this can be sent out to all the interested parties, all the folks who will be participating in this ahead of time, and then have one person aggregate it all together for everyone to review and provide an opportunity to add as needed at the meeting. So we can get some of this done ahead of time. And we want to make sure that we have everyone who works with that student fill it out, especially the parent. And then we can pull that all together. Some folks have done it at the meeting, and if you have the time and the team wants to walk through that at the meeting, you are certainly well within your rights to do it that way. It will extend the amount of time that the meeting takes. I often find it is helpful to have everyone complete it ahead of time. And I've often asked the building team coordinator, whoever's responsible for helping set up all of this, to aggregate all the comments into one document and then provide it to everyone when they come to the meeting, and certainly have in your agenda a time to work on that student profile. But you want to have students look at it through the lens of, what do we need to add? Let's go through each of these sections, definitely review it, and then have folks kind of tweak it up on that day of the meeting. If this can be done at least a couple days before the meeting, and I know this does not always work, but if it can be done and they can forward that to you as the facilitator, it will help you to read through that. It will help you prepare and familiarize yourself with the information that's discussed. So for example, if you see it more in a tone where folks are looking and talking about a student's need, then at the meeting as a facilitator, I would want to turn it around and say, oh, I see this on here. Can you give me a short, brief phrase or sentence of what that means, of what the student can do? So try to turn it around, because those are the things that are going to be our bridges. I can't emphasize that enough. Another thing that I have seen done at the toolkit meetings is I've seen facilitators come in with poster paper, and either they're gathering the information at the meeting, or they take what they have gotten ahead of time and they fill it out on that poster paper. So then we have around the room everything listed, what we know about the student and what they can do, their strengths, their interests, some of their abilities within some of the content areas, their abilities within some of the motor areas. All of that makes that a quick access for our participants to get some potential ideas for bridges when we start working through that section C. So hopefully this is making sense and you're jotting down some notes. So now let's move on to the next section, which is component C. It is the classroom considerations tool. So this is where the meat of the meeting will take place. So this is where you're going to gather all of that information. And again, you can see the cover page looks very similar to the other ones. We also have, again, this page which shows you the implementation sequence. These are the things you're going to gather in this particular phase and who all is involved. So this is what the tool looks like. And you can see in the left-hand column is where we will have the general educator, or the profile of the general classroom is captured. So in the version that I shared, it has electronic drop-down boxes, so it makes it a pretty simple process for our general educators to complete. If the student's in an elementary school and only sees one teacher, then only one teacher will complete that left-hand side of this toolkit. Just the left column, step 1. If the student's in secondary setting and they have multiple teachers and they rotate classes for science and math and ELA and social studies and specials, and you want to be looking at all of those classrooms, each teacher must complete their very own. So this is when we move into instructional delivery and social routines. This is all part of that document that we are asking the general educator to complete. And you notice there's a spot if within, say, that section of instructional format, something is not there that happens in that classroom, then the teacher is able to type that in. And so we can get a good idea of the realities of that Gen Ed classroom. And then there's some general questions about the response to diversity and interpersonal relationships. So the team is identifying, then we'll take this tool, and in that second column, that's step 2, identify the potential barriers. So I'm going to zip back here, see if I can take you back. So if we are looking, say, at this particular page where it has instructional material and methods, and it's around printed materials, frequency of use. Do they use it at all? Do they use it never? Do they use it frequently, or do they use it only occasionally? We'll have the teacher identify that. And if as a team you say, well, this is 7th grade and the student is reading on a 1st grade level, so access to the text or the print is going to be a barrier. You know, maybe the workbook also has vocabulary and text that may be challenging for the student. We would mark that as a barrier. Then it's going to be up to the team to go back and think about, well, what could we do to bridge the barrier? Well, we know the student reads on a 1st grade level. Is there an adapted text that could be used? Is there an adapted workbook? Would there need to be adaptations, and what would they look like? Could the student partner with a peer? So we would go back and think about what we know about the student to help bridge those barriers in that step 3. The other thing that's really important, that when you get down to thinking about where you're going to focus your time and conversation, the coding key comes into great play. So if the teacher doesn't use a textbook and the student has a barrier to print, to identifying print, because they only read on a 1st grade level, and this is a 7th grade text, and they don't use the textbook in the class, say they use trade books more, or we're not going to focus as much on the textbook as something that they use frequently. So it's something the student's going to see often in the classroom. You're going to get the team to gravitate to that area and spend more time thinking about bridging the barriers to those kinds of resources, as opposed to something the teacher never uses and maybe just occasionally uses. Does that make sense? So your bridges come directly from that student profile, everything we know about what the student can do. Some facilitator tips with this section or this component. If you can, have the regular educator whose classroom is being considered complete that, one per teacher, prior to the meeting. And again, if you can have a copy of that, that would be great. If it can all be digitally completed, that's even better. No one has to aggregate anything because they should only be filling out the left column, one per teacher and class. It's nice to have copies of that for everyone at the meeting, so then they can take notes as we're talking about it. And then work with the team on the flow. So what I mean by that is I've seen several different ways for this toolkit to be completed. I've seen a team go through identifying all the barriers next to the realities of the classroom, which gets a little cumbersome and it kind of takes away from the focus of that bridging. But they do all the barriers first, then they go back and build the bridges. Or they complete a section at a time, so we're just going to do the printed materials, think about what all the barriers are, and then think about how we're going to bridge that. And one reason that's kind of nice is because you often are spiraling. So you're using maybe those same bridges. What's going to help the student who has a print disability with a text is probably also going to help them when you look at a trade book or you think about the workbook. So that's kind of nice. Or some teams have just gone straight across. After they identify the barrier, they want to go right to the bridge. That's going to be, as a facilitator, you can determine how you want to work through the flow, what's either most comfortable for you or what's going to work best for your team. So finally, in section C, or that component C, there is a final step that talks about discussing the appropriate options and identifying how they would be implemented. Teams I've worked with, this is a great tool for that IEP team to take this back and take all the ideas that were generated within that section C, and then the IEP team determines what's going to be implemented and what's going to be put into that IEP. At your toolkit meeting, you may not have all exclusively IEP team members, but that the IEP team can then make those decisions and determine what would be most effective in that student's IEP. I think this chart will assist that conversation to determine, what must be in place to support the strategy. Because it's important to understand that interventions or changes to what will occur for a student should be considered within the framework of the IEP team. So IEP teams can take the recommendations from the toolkit, and then they can determine what will be added for the student. The part of the toolkit that can act as a framework, this part of the toolkit really acts as a framework for that conversation. And then the components that can be considered within the IEP, especially design instruction and or supports for school personnel. So if we need more consultation with the AT, I think that's an example they have there. The AT consultant will provide the teacher training, and the school will purchase software tech, or whatever. The tech coordinator will install on the computer. So having more training for the teacher is part of supports for school personnel. So you want to make sure you capture that in the IEP to ensure that the follow-through for the toolkit occurs. Finally, we have component D. And component D is really a self-check for teams, walks you through that a documentation that supports the effectiveness and consideration of the process and strategies. It's not one of our active tools as a facilitator, but it is a tool that as a facilitator you can recommend for that IEP team to consider as they move forward. So let me show you what this looks like. So it's just your check, before the team meeting. So, parents were given the opportunity to identify preferences, priorities for their child's program, and share information about strategies that have and have not been successful in previous years. So it goes a little bit beyond what the toolkit can do, but it also brings in pieces of the toolkit as you think about, like, during the IEP meeting. So when they think about, have you talked about supplementary aids and services rather than alternative placements? So these are really things around the toolkit. So was there a team discussion that led to the identification of some supplementary aids and services that represent a comprehensive and sound approach to supporting participation in the general education classroom? And it refers them back to step 4 of the toolkit. So it kind of cross-references what's happening in the toolkit. So then after the IEP meeting, there's additional pieces to think about, how data is collected to ensure the effectiveness of the supplementary aids and services that were selected. So it is, again, a barometer that helps you measure the effectiveness of what the team determined. So some additional facilitator tips for the meeting. This is really critical as a facilitator to think about these components because they will greatly impact the flow of the meeting. And those who have been pioneers of this work before this have found these tips to be incredibly important. So when we think about scheduling the meeting, you want to work with the team to determine the best time. Typically, if all the work is done ahead of time, an efficient toolkit can occur probably within 3 hours. But sometimes, because of the needs and situations, so if you're in a secondary setting and you're examining multiple classrooms, you may need to schedule more time or even a full day. So when we think about some other pieces that go along with this, we want to think about some of the tips that we shared on the previous slides will also help you with efficiently using the time to focus on the barriers and bridges. So thinking about the teacher completing things ahead of time, having documents like the student profile and the section C completed ahead of time, and provide just enough time. You want to review them. You want to acknowledge them in the meeting. You want to make sure that they are talked about and things are added or revised as needed, is going to make your meeting much more efficient. You can start with blank documents. There's nothing that says you can't, but it will take more time and more conversation to move your team to get to the outcomes. Some additional tips. Highly recommend or strongly recommend that you develop an agenda. Try to give some approximate times for the different sections within the components, like how much time you're going to spend on the student profile, how much time within each section on section C. Don't be afraid to be specific. You can adjust it as you're going. They're just approximations, and it helps to keep the team on track. And sometimes avoid some circular conversations, and by that I mean just things that tend to go around and around without a resolution. So you want to make sure that we're not admiring any problems, and that what we're doing is we're keeping the team on track by moving through the sections. So another great idea is to assign a timekeeper, someone who can kind of keep their eye on the agenda and the approximate times, and signal you as you're going through, because you're going to be busy listening to the conversations, guiding the discussion. So you want to get the signal from that timekeeper to give you an idea of what's going and what should be where you should be moving, so that if you need to allow more time where you're at, if you feel that's important, go ahead and do that. But also know you may be able to say, we've got to move on. And we can address that in the next section. Or sometimes one of my pieces that I like to do is I like to say, that's a really good conversation. You know, maybe it's something about a barrier in a class, but we're on the student profile. I'll ask someone, write that down, because we're going to get to that in the next section. And that's really important. I don't think the team wants to forget about that, but we need to kind of table it for the moment, but then bring it back when you need to bring it back. And that will help you move through that meeting. Very important thing is to display this document during the meeting. So you want to display the student profile, and you want to display, when it's appropriate, that section C, reflecting each teacher's responses, and ask the district to help you provide a means for projecting the document. So you want to get a projector. You want to assign a note taker, someone who's capturing the conversation. It's preferable that it's not someone that's part of the team discussions, so that their attention to the discussion doesn't get taken away by taking the notes. But you definitely want that to be someone other than you, because your focus is going to be listening to that conversation and keeping it going and getting every piece that you need captured and down on that document. Okay? Some additional facilitator tips for the meeting. As you're facilitating the process, you want to ask guiding and clarifying questions. So remember, you're not a contributing member of the meeting, but as a facilitator, you're guiding the conversation. You want to pause and allow everyone to read the notes that are being captured, that are up on the screen. Make additions, corrections, suggestions. You want to extend conversations in addition to asking clarifying questions. So if you need more, or you want someone to explain further, you want to say, can you tell me some more about that? Or can you describe what you're saying? So we want to get people to get as descriptive and as clear as possible, so that we capture things accurately. So your goal is to lead the conversation. You're not really interjecting into the conversation. You should provide information as needed, such as definitions, maybe if they need an explanation of the law. I always kind of want folks to think neutral, because your goal is to be a great listener. And you're not really considered a team member here, but a person who's really organizing the team's thoughts and ideas. Say, honor every idea and thought. Even if you're thinking, wow, wowzer, I don't know if that's such a great idea. You don't know. Let the team decide. Just have them type it down. Provide the team the ability to be honest and value all shared ideas. Let the IEP team, when it comes time to think about what they're going to adopt, what they're going to keep, what they're going to maybe collapse into one support, or however they want to do it, let them debate the merits of an idea when they consider whether or not to add it to the supports listed in the IEP. So, and as each and every suggestion is added, make sure, redirect everyone on the team to read it, adjust, make sure it's okay, keep checking in, is that okay, is everyone happy with that, because this document will be the record for the IEP team. Whoops, let me go back here. You want to encourage participants to think outside the box. The ideas do not have to necessarily be traditional in nature. In fact, they shouldn't be, because what we want to do is make sure that we're using what we know about the student to bridge those barriers. So here's an example. A toolkit I was facilitating was really examining the structures for students to demonstrate safety with equipment necessary for the class. There was a lot of concern that the student was not going to be able to handle the equipment and thus not be able to have a valued role in that classroom. So the team needed to really think about this. So they really anticipated prior to the meeting that the student who was the focus of the toolkit would struggle with this. So the team walked through the students' strengths and interests. They came up with some great lists, and it is just an incredible experience to be in a place where we're just talking about the things that a student can do. So one of the things that the team identified in this situation was that the student has a strength with his desire, his interaction, and cooperativeness when working with peers. He totally valued his peers. It was in a middle school situation, so understandable. So the team took this as a bridge for this barrier. So what they did is that, and this is, I thought, really thought outside the box, that they would partner the student with peers to learn the safety rules for each piece of equipment. And they did kind of pare it down to a couple pieces instead of all of them, because that was what worked best for the student. And they determined that in the implementation stage, as they adopted it through the IEP, that there would be a certain flex period that the district had in the schedule each day, and that's when the student would be partnering with their peers to learn the safety of the peer was going to read some of the rules. It's going to teach the student what it meant. They were going to practice some things, of course, with the teacher also there. It was really quite a clever way to think about bridging this barrier. So the IP team accepted the bridge, and it was as a support. And I can tell you, I'm very happy to report it worked out very well for everyone, but it wasn't a traditional way that this was set up, or that the students were to show what they know in regard to all the safety equipment. But let me tell you, it was the bridge for this student, and it worked. And it worked because the team went through this process and really seriously considered what it was the student could do and what the student's interests were and their strengths, and used those to overcome that other barrier. Some additional tips, if you can, and I don't know how this would work, but from Patton's perspective, we definitely recommend for your first facilitation, if possible, that you partner with another consultant who's previously facilitated the toolkit. Having the support in the room is always a plus, and it's a great learning tool, and it really kind of helps calm some nerves, and it also helps you if you get stuck and you need some modeling, you've got someone there who can help you do that. Be prepared. Make sure you review any documents that you're given ahead of time. Make sure you have your agenda done. Be prepared as much as you can within your control to have this meeting ready to go as soon as it starts. The other thing I wanted to share with you that's really important is that Patton does have an online course around this that goes into a lot more detail than what we did over this past 20-30 minutes. So we want to make sure that you know that it's there. There's even a video of a simulated toolkit you can watch. But what I do have to say is that we do encourage you to do that. But unfortunately, we are in the process of transferring over our new website, which is exciting. There's a lot of great things about it, but getting everything uploaded that had been on the old site is kind of slow. I want you to think about, if you can, like traffic on I-95 heading north on a Sunday evening in the summer. You don't go anywhere real fast, but it's coming. Everything is being loaded onto there, and the course is coming back and will soon be available in the near future. So as soon as it's available, we will notify Lisa, and she can get the information out to you. So it does provide you an opportunity to go through, receive a certificate that you can, it's very frameable, that identifies you as a trained facilitator of the toolkit. The other thing you can do is, if you're anxious and want to get to this as soon as possible, you can always check on our website, which is www.patent.net. And if you click on the supports tab, and the very first thing at the top of the tabs is inclusive practices. And when you click on that, there is different options. And there is the SaS Consideration Toolkit training. And there's a little right arrow next to that. You want to click on that, and that will take you to the place where you can look and see if that course is available yet. The other thing that you can do also is, at the end here we do have our contact information, and I will also offer again that you can contact any one of us across our patent offices to check on the status of that, or to check on how to get access to that. Wow, that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. Thank you so much for your time and for taking some interest with the toolkit. I can tell you, of all the things that I've done over the years to support inclusive practices, it has been one of the most wonderful experiences because it's a process that touches students and teachers right at the classroom level. And it can make, I have seen it make incredible inroads for participation in learning. So that's what makes it exciting. And to be a part of that is really, I think, a gift that we've been given. And so glad that it is a resource that is available for you to use out in your schools and with your teams. Again, if you have additional questions, you want additional information, you're curious about the course, please don't hesitate to contact myself. I'm Sharon Leonard at Patent Harrisburg, or you can contact any of our other regional consultants, depending on where you're located at. Just know no question is too small or too big. We certainly are here to answer your questions and to help you as you need. So good luck as you support your teams this year and as you continue to make differences in the educational lives of students. Thank you.